En we gaan meteen door met Francesca de Cha. Ga beginnen. Je spreekt Nederlands, maar je doet je speech in het Engels. Kan je ook in het Nederlands aankondigen. Je hebt heel lang in Syrië gewoond. Door sommigen wordt Syrië als het schoolvoorbeeld gezien van klimaatverandering. Waardoor de oorlog is gekomen. Voor Syrië is het dan misschien nu te laat al, want het land ligt helemaal in puin. Maar ik hoop dat jij ons kan vertellen wat de Veiligheidsraad en de wereld zouden moeten leren voor de toekomst van Syrië. Aan jou het woord.
Ja, ik heb ook een PowerPoint. Als die aan kan, zou dat heel fijn zijn. Thank you. Yeah, and so I apologize for speaking in English, but just the topic of Syria is easier to do in English for me. So, as you heard, I lived in Syria for a long time. My focus, originally a journalist, spent 15 years working on water issues in the whole Middle East, and then turned that into a PhD, so now I'm kind of in between. Today I've been asked to briefly comment on the link between climate change and the war in Syria, and water management in general in the Middle East, North Africa region. I'm not going to lie, I find this quite challenging because each of these topics is so multifaceted and complex that commenting on any of them individually, let alone in combination in the space of just a few minutes, risks hugely oversimplifying vast and very complicated topics. Having said that, I'm going to do my best to contribute to a very rich discussion tonight. Firstly, regarding the link between climate change in Syria and the war in Syria, I am going to be quite brief because I don't believe that there is a link. I know that there are many researchers and experts in the past few years who have disagreed on that point. I just cannot find in me, I feel quite strongly about this, so I get a bit wound up about it. So if you go back to the first protests that happened in Syria at the beginning in 2011, these were protests about freedom, about democracy, about people who had spent 40 years in a dictatorship. The first protests were actually in Damascus. They were people demonstrating, demanding the freedom of political prisoners who were their family. The next protests were in Dera, which had to do with a bunch of young kids who had graffitied on the wall, copying slogans from the Arab Spring. They were imprisoned, they were tortured. Their families demanded their release. The Syrian government said, you can make other children, and if you can't, we will come and make them for you. Great. Okay, so this is what set off the conflict in Syria. It's not climate change. The Syrians did not go out into the street because it didn't rain. They went out into the street to protest 40 years of repression. Having said that, I'm not denying that climate change is not happening. Climate change is happening in the whole Middle East and North Africa, and it's certainly going to get a lot worse. My problem with the link in this particular instance of the war in Syria and climate change is that it ends up now being a kind of academic discussion, because how are you going to prove climate change is there, the war is there? How are you going to, how do you know what influenced, how much influence it was? You can't quantify this, and it ends up being a pointless debate, whereas actually what is much more important at this moment in the Middle East, and it's a crisis that's been developing for 50 years and that is kind of overlooked for incomprehensible reasons. And this is the water crisis, which lies actually below any climate crisis that's going to come. So that's actually what I want to talk to you about tonight. There's a crisis of water governance, and it's actually reaching in Iraq, in Iran, in Saudi Arabia. It's really reaching a critical point, and it is very urgent that it is addressed. So I'm going to try to give you the lowdown in a couple of minutes. So this is a graph that very roughly gives you an impression of water availability. So this is So just so you know, in water circles, 1,000 cubic meters per person per year is considered, below this, it's considered water scarcity. Below 500, it's considered absolute scarcity. Now, as you can see, in the last 50 years, there's been a very, very sharp decline. Also, not on this slide, but the world average today in 2011, so at this point, or like this point, was 8,900. So what this slide shows is that A, the Middle East has always been water scarce, but also that the situation now and going forward is acute. 5% of the world's population lives in the Middle East, and they only have 1% of the global water resources. 40% of the Arab population live in conditions of absolute scarcity today. 12 countries in the Middle East are already below the absolute scarcity level, and 7 countries are below 200 cubic meters per person per year. So this means like there is no water already now. It's difficult to give you a full overview of the roots of this crisis. I'll go very briefly and quickly. The first is the uncontrolled population growth. So the population of the region has exploded since 1950. To give you a concrete figure, in Syria in 1950, there were 3.3 million inhabitants. In 2012, there were 22 million. They're living on the same amount of water. The amount of water has not increased. So you understand there is less water per person, tensions rise. The second issue is that this is kind of linked. So everything after 1950, everything kind of, which for centuries had been quite stable in this water scarce area, things kind of took off. Technological development, it was the creation of nation states in the Middle East. Each country wanted to secure their own water, so dams were built, groundwater was extracted on a scale never seen before, including non-renewable fossil groundwater. So this is water that's not coming back, that's been there for thousands of years, but it's now nearly gone. The technological development, interestingly, this is a bit abstract, but it also led to a change in the ideas about water. So people started assuming, and the narrative of governments was, there's an endless supply. We can continue building dams and irrigating agriculture, and you don't have to save water. Water was free in the Middle East for farmers, for not anymore so much, but this for years was the case. So wastefulness was not really discussed or thought about. Next is the expansion of irrigated agriculture. So this is again linked to the technology, to the growing population, but also to the instability in the region, because each country wanted to ensure its own food security. You can't count on your neighbors, you've got to all do it yourself. So this led to ludicrous situations like the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia exporting wheat and irrigating wheat in the desert with fossil water. Syria, until 2008, was an exporter of wheat. Very important for Syria. Wheat was a red line, even when water supplies were definitely, deficits already occurred before the year 2000. Wheat was a red line, was not to be discussed. Today, still, regionally, so I'm talking the whole Middle East and North Africa, 85% of the water goes to agriculture. And this agriculture is often very wasteful. The crops that are being grown are not really economically very viable. So there is a lot to be gained there, actually. A lot of progress can be made if effort is put into it. In Syria, before the war started, 90% of water went to agriculture. So now then, the last one is abstract, but at the same time, there was most countries in the region set up a quite rigid system of water management. So it was built on infrastructure, on more supply management, so more people, so we're going to look for more water, we're going to deeper wells. And this is again about the mindset, which was unable to actually cope with changes, so changes in population, but also changes in the environment, unable to see the limits of the environment, which had already been reached, in the 1990s. But there was more and more, like we have to go further. In Jordan, where there is so little water, they're now pumping water from the border of Saudi Arabia uphill through a pipeline to Amman. And in Amman, the whole water network is very leaky. So all this fossil water is now leaking out into the groundwater of Amman. So it's full of contradictions. I will just give you a quick, very quick. So these are little photographic impressions. So this is the Barada Valley. This is this river used to supply Damascus and the gardens around Damascus. In the 1990s, all the water of the river was taken from the source and deviated to supply the city of Damascus with drinking water. So that meant that this is the Barada River in 2009. And this man is a farmer, and his orchards were dying. This is the Jordan River, the Holy Jordan River. This is actually at the baptism site. This is Israel, and this is Jordan. And this is sewage water. And this is because of damming, diversion, agricultural projects in Israel, in Syria. All the water is being taken out, and the Dead Sea, some of you may have heard about this, but the Dead Sea is dying because 1 meter so it's shrinking by 1 meter a year, and huge sinkholes are appearing all around the coast. This is a source on the border between Syria and Turkey. It used to be the largest karst spring in the world, and it dried up in 2001. Because of basically agricultural projects on both sides of the border. Cotton being grown in Turkey, and cotton also being grown in Syria. And the land around this is all semi-arid steppe, so the land is also cannot actually support such intensive agriculture. So now climate change is coming on top of this. This is a crisis, and climate change is coming on top of it. So it's making this already very bad situation worse. So my advice to the Security Council would be, in the Middle East, rather than just focusing on climate change, you need to broaden it. You need to address the broader environmental crisis that consists of water scarcity, resource mismanagement, and also a lack of cooperation between the countries, because all the countries are acting. There's a lot of conflict, there's a lot of disagreement also about shared water, and a lot of the water is shared, and there is a lack of cooperation historically. It's very difficult to solve this. So it's going to involve difficult and politically sensitive discussions, but governments in the region are going to have to take responsibility and are going to really have to make very bold steps for the future. I want to end with an idea which His Royal Highness Prince Hassan of Jordan, who's a great environmental fighter, he has come up with the idea of resilience, and that these societies in the Middle East, the communities, the governments, we need to build resilient systems, which means the change that is coming and the instability that will probably always be there in the Middle East, the systems, the water systems, the environmental systems need to be built to be able to cope with that change, because otherwise there will not be a future for the Middle East. Thank you.
All right, Francesca, thanks very much for your talk. A rather worrying talk, I should say. Before I start, again, if there are any questions from the audience, please raise your hand, and we'll come to you as soon as possible. In the meantime, is there any positive development going on in the Middle East? I already asked Louise. She was not very hopeful. Are you?
No.
Not at all?
It's very hard to be optimistic about the Middle East. I have to say that there are countries are making efforts. People, after years of not looking, now the water scarcity has reached such an advanced stage that you can't look away. In Jordan, there is no water, so people are aware that there is water scarcity, because literally there is no water coming out of the tap. So,
what are they doing there? They're drinking water from bottles, or?
They get water. So in Amman, I think it might have changed now since they're pumping this water up, but it used to be 24 hours of water a week. And you have, this is in the whole Middle East, you have these roof tankers and you just have to stretch for the week, and otherwise you buy from water tankers and the quality not guaranteed, public health hazards.
How much more years can this go on without major disruptions?
Well, I think we're
already there.
We're there, yeah. Unfortunately, I mean, I think Iraq is in a very, very bad situation. Photos on Twitter from last week show people wading across the Tigris. The Tigris is like one of the 3 big rivers. It's heartbreaking. So
they're wading through to the other side.
Yeah, it's like that deep. So that's a terrible image, and so that and I mean in Iran there's been also massive groundwater overexploitation, and now aquifers are running dry. So Iran is also really on the edge. Saudi has immense problems. Like we haven't even begun to know what's going to happen there. So yeah.
Because they build all these big cities and they don't have water to feed
Well,
them.
they're desalinating, so that's okay. But there is just a huge crisis. Now, actually, in Saudi, they are waking up. So they've started charging people for water, which they never did. The desalinated water, which costs, that was all subsidized. And people, so interestingly, UAE, that means the Dubai, Abu Dhabi, Saudi, these are among, after America and Canada, the largest water users per person in the world, in the desert. So these people use like 400 liters of water a day.
They keep on showering themselves.
Right, something like that. And so here in Europe, it's like between 100 and 140 or so. So immense. And so now there is this environmental awareness that's starting, but it really needs to not just start, but really.
But you just talked about the prince in Jordania, who's.
Yeah, so Prince
who is
Hassan.
he?
Yeah, so Jordan
He's the son of the king?
No, he's the brother, no, the uncle actually of the current king. No, and in Jordan, I have to say they are, because they're so water scarce and now immensely under pressure also from the refugee crisis, they are being quite innovative. They are really trying to change the way that they deal with water, but then, you still have difficult questions like agriculture. Like, are you going to stop agriculture? No, you need to modernize it. You need to then deal with big, powerful families who maybe don't want to change. So this is a very sensitive area. And of course, Jordan is dependent on water from its neighbors. So they have water that they get from Syria, which now they're not talking to, etc. So then you have the Palestinian issue, Israel. It's lovely.
I've got 1 more minute. If there's any pressing question, please raise your hand or be silent forever. Yeah. Je kan het Nederlands vragen als je wil.
Oh. En ik was eigenlijk benieuwd om vanwege Turkije met zijn dammen die hij dus in werking gaat stellen. Wat wordt daar internationaal tegen? Wordt daar überhaupt internationaal iets over gezegd of tegen gedaan of druk op Turkije gezet om dat niet te doen?
Nou, de Ilizu-dam die nu wordt opgevuld, dat is waar het nu om ging met Irak. Dus daar hebben ze nu, vorige week heeft Turkije heel grootmoedig gezegd, we make the sacrifice of not filling up the dam, omdat wij onze Irakese broeders willen helpen. Maar de Ilizu-dam, dat loopt al 20 jaar of zo, dat ze die willen bouwen, maar dat daar gewoon geen financiering voor is gekomen. Omdat de Wereldbank onder andere, en er waren gewoon geen fondsen voor, omdat het juist een transboundary gevoelig project was. Dus ik weet nu, ik moet me verontschuldigen, ik weet niet de details van hoe ze dat wel gefinancierd hebben. Overigens heb ik in 2001 iemand van GAP, van dat hele grote al die dammen project, geïnterviewd in Ankara. En ik was de hele dag meegesleept door een soort vertaler, minder basically, die mij naar we hebben ook vrouwenprojecten, we hebben ook education projects, allemaal van wat is dit een geweldig project. Toen kwam ik bij de laatste man en dat was gewoon een ingenieur. En ik zei ja, maar en dan die Ilizu-dam en dan de milieugevolgen daarvan. En he said, We don't have time to think about the environment. We are going to build that dam. The GAP project will be a three-legged dog. If we don't finish the Elizu Dam, we'll think about the environment later.
Mijn god.
En die minder die zat daar echt van, de hele dag.
Ik word hier niet vrolijk van, maar toch
Nee,
hartelijk dank, Francesca.